In this episode of Plants of the Gods, we'll hear host Mark Plotkin in deep conversation with mycologist Paul Stamets, best known for his role in the documentary and accompanying book, Fantastic Fungi. We'll question our understanding of how and why medications and other substances interact with one another, the untapped potential of fungi, and more as Stamets and Dr. Plotkin ponder mushrooms, magic, and mortality.
Hi, viewers and listeners, wherever you are in the world. We are at the ESPD 55 conference, that is the Ethnopharmacological Search for Psychoactive Drugs conference. It's the 55th year anniversary since the original, and this time it's hosted by Dennis McKenna and the McKenna Academy at St. Giles's House, a magnificent country manor in Dorset, England. With me are the famed fungi researcher Paul Stamets, to the left, and ethnobotanist and rainforest conservationist Mark Plotkin, who has a podcast titled Plants of the Gods, covering plant hallucinogens, amongst many other things. We are in the fourth and final day of the conference. So, gentlemen, perhaps we can begin with sharing some of your thoughts on this event.
You're my senior, you go.
Okay. Well, it's an incredible gathering of leaders in the field of mycobiology, ethnobotany, ethnomycology, and it's a very interdisciplinary discipline where I think everybody's here to both teach and learn. And that's kind of unique. Usually when you go to a conference, you're there to lecture much more than you are to listen, in my experience. And so being here to both teach and to learn is very fulfilling.
There's an enormous deep well of expertise here with a diversity of people who've spent all their lives studying the subject. And we are, on a continuum of thought leaders over thousands of years. In a sense, we're carrying some of the torches now to pass on to the next generation. But although there's such a diversity of expertise here, there's a commonality and a unanimity of opinion. And that unanimity of opinion is that these sacred medicines are teaching us how important it is to protect the Earth's biosphere. And the biosphere is in jeopardy, and the lessons from indigenous people, and we're all indigenous to the Earth, so it's indigenous people throughout the world are singing the same song or shouting the same warning. And that is, unified together, we can help protect future generations and honor our ancestors and protect our descendants. And the cautionary concerns I think we all share is the system has become destabilized, and it's destabilizing to a very dangerous level. The repercussions of human activity is going to have collateral damage on the innocents. And the innocents are people who are very well intended. The innocents could be people oblivious to so much of the climate chaos that other people in the world are suffering. And this is a concern. We have to become ecologically better educated. We need wisdom in our actions so we can protect the ecosystem. And so I'm really delighted to be here with my brother Mark. And we've been in hyperspace in common, if not physically in close proximity. But I feel like I've known you for thousands of years.
I feel like I've known Paul longer than thousands of years, but we'll declare it a tie. For me, this is one of the great aspects of this conference, to finally meet the great Paul Stamets in person. I personally knew Gordon Wasson. I trained at the museum, and he was and is regarded as the father of ethnomycology. But in my book, Paul Stamets has taken that position since Gordon has moved on. And to hear someone speak with his depth of knowledge, field knowledge, time with indigenous peoples, time with the fungi, to talk about the diversity of all things. Because when I started in conservation, it was all about the rainforest and elephants and whales. Nobody talked about indigenous peoples, and God forbid you didn't even think of fungi.
Yeah. Well, let me add on to that. I met Gordon several times. I went to 3 or 4 of his lectures. And let this historical record be very clear. Every lecture that I attended by R. Gordon Wasson, the first thing he expressed is his love and gratitude and acknowledgement of his wife, Tina Wasson, to the point where he would be cascading with tears, just remembering her. It was Valentina Wasson, a Russian physician, who first exposed and turned on and actually informed Gordon Wasson about mushrooms. He was mycophobic, she was mycophilic. They invented those words to describe the dialectic of their 2 points of view from a cultural perspective. And then from that dance of those dialectical opposites was born this lifelong study. And so Valentina, unfortunately, Tina Wasson died in 1958 at the height of this reemergence, so to speak. And then their knowledge came from Maria Sabina. So really, you have two giants, two elders, two incredibly wise women who were really the birth of this reemergence. And it's from the generosity and collaboration of these woman elders that really set the stage. And I think it's really important that we acknowledge that. Even though Gordon Wasson gets all the credit, it needs to really be rebalanced. Tina Wasson should get the majority of the credit. R. Gordon Wasson was Tina's student, you know?
Well, I did a podcast episode called The Holy Trinity of Ethnomycology, Schultes, Wasson, and Hoffman. And I said, we have to expand that to 5 people. That has to be Maria Sabina and Tina Wasson. And interestingly enough, looking at that timeline you referred to, Paul, if you look at my favorite paper of Wasson's, The Death of Claudius, Mushroom for Murders, it's by R. Gordon Wasson, even though Tina played a key role. But with the last great act of his life, he donated everything to Harvard, and he insisted to be called the Tina and Gordon Wasson Ethnomycological Library. So I think he came to that realization himself long before we did.
And I'm happy to be the first recipient of the Tina Gordon Wasson Award from the Mycological Society of America. And that is now an annual position or honor that's been given to emergent experts in the field. So there's an interesting union, a pairing of opposites, this dance that I'd like to get into. Most people may not realize that all plants are part fungi. The endophytic fungi that are inside the plants are producing a lot of alkaloids and indeed a lot of tryptamines. Mm-hmm. And the plants are producing tryptamines. But I like to say we're in this beautiful place, and I'm staring out over this great scene of many diverse trees and grasses. And if you stripped away all the cellulose, all the lignin, everything but tryptamines, what would we see?
Fungi.
You would see fungal networks, and you would see the very same shape of grasses and trees. That they're a universal molecule of nature, and they're essential to life. And so I find that fascinating. We live in a tryptamine universe, and yet we can't see the tryptamines. And now with the introduction of admixtures and MAOI. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors with tryptamine-containing plants. I'm real interested in looking at the non-psilocybin active mushrooms, using it with perhaps Syrian rue, which contains MAOI inhibitors. Now, let me have a big precautionary statement here, because this gets into some medically important issues. If you are on antidepressants, oftentimes which have MAOIs, monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and you have, for instance, seafood and cheese and red wine, and then you take a tryptamine-rich plant, tyrosines can pass through the system, which raises your blood pressure and can cause cardiac arrest. So this is why I think indigenous people's knowledge has been so critical for setting the stage, of preparation. You don't consume food before, ingest ayahuasca, before you trip on mushrooms. You clear your belly so you don't have this co-occurrence. So this is something, with the experimentation of MAOIs, I think it's really important that people understand that they fast. They do not eat foods that will allow some of these toxins to go through. Remember, monoamine oxidases are important for you. They detoxify, compounds in your stomach that would otherwise be deleterious. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, it's the double-edged sword. It's very shamanic what you say, Paul, because on the one hand, ayahuasca is not just ayahuasca. There's always something else mixed in, speaking of monoamine oxidase inhibitors. By the same token, you shouldn't take some medicines with grapefruit juice.
Oh,
so
there you go.
This is something where Western medicine has really failed us in terms of not looking at interactions, which are both positive and negative. And I think this is part of the future of medicine. And in some ways, this just proves the genius of what I was taught in classes, or primitive peoples, where they say, don't eat this before you eat these mushrooms or before you take this snuff or whatever. And we're coming around to the idea that if you're going to spend your life taking anti-cholesterol drugs, anti-high blood pressure drugs, we need to figure out what the effect is in the human body for 40 years.
Indeed, and that's a precautionary statement. People experimenting with MAOIs must be extraordinarily careful.
Yes, yeah. And that brings up another point. You know, Michael Pollan's wonderful book, he talks about the fact that often the people that seek out the magic mushrooms or going down in the Amazon to take ayahuasca are emotionally very fragile, emotionally unstable. And these are the last people that should be doing stuff without a master in charge, whether it's a doctor, a physician, or a guide, what have you. So there's a great need for people that can direct these things. There aren't enough shamans to go around, not in Oaxaca, not in the Amazon, to make sure that people are prepped correctly and managed correctly. And if you get in trouble, which everybody does at some point, there's somebody to help you through.
With the advancement of any medicine, there's always going to be casualties.
Right.
And the cost of these casualties is to inform science how to better have therapeutic guardrails that are established. So this happens with any adventure, scientific adventures, whether it's a voyage across the ocean or an exploration into the North Pole. We learn from the lessons of our experiences. We're really in a continuum of rediscovering or discovering nature and all of its bounty and all of its combinations. The timelines of the use of entheogenic plants are not set in stone. It's not like they had a start date and a stop date. Right. It's a continuum that goes into the future. All of you listening to this right now, you will be the inventors, where humans are natural experimenters. The cost of that experimentation can be severe. So eyes wide open and being extraordinarily careful. And, I am going to sound like a conservative here, but it's really important, especially now, that you do things legally. Because illegal activity could be a train wreck for this movement.
True.
The advance right now through government, through ballot measures, through, state initiatives, and hopefully national initiatives, we're close to the end zone here. Mm-hmm. We can't fumble the ball. Right. So we need an extraordinary amount of discipline. We need people to be adults. And I think this is a time critical that we can get past, into the goal zone of having a fundamental change in the understanding of psychedelics in particular, where the governments realize that psychedelics are not addictive. In fact, they're anti-addictive. Article that was published, I think, April 7th in Nature's Scientific Reports shows that over 114,000 addicts or people who have used opioids, and there's only one psychedelic that was associated with a reduction of opioid use. It's called opioid use disorder, psilocybin. Now think, if psilocybin reduces opioid use, and opioid use is a fundamental problem throughout our society, how much money that saves the government, how it saves families, how the court system, law enforcement. Yes. We reduce addiction, we reduce crime.
And suffering.
And so, this is huge. If you could save the budgets of the governments hundreds of billions of dollars through permitting one dose of psilocybin, very rarely, and because it has such a long residual effect, and by definition, psilocybin is anti-addictive. So anybody who's not had a high dose of psilocybin, let me tell you, a common refrain. The next day, when you look at the mushrooms, you say, no way. I'm not touching this for a long time.
I can echo that with ayahuasca as well.
Yeah.
But I don't know if you saw it just about 3 weeks ago, as we were all preparing for this conference here in England, there was a paper on a new plant which blocks opiate addiction. And it's a Papaveraceae, it's opium family.
Wow.
Totally from left field.
Wow.
So what I am telling people is psilocybin is not the end of the story, even if it is the Einstein molecule, nor is ayahuasca, nor is coca. There's more stuff out there, which is why, A, we need to protect what's out there, and B, we need to learn from the people that know these things. Indigenous peoples do not know everything, but they've led us to most of these things. But here's a question for you, because I've listened to so many interviews with you and so many of your talks. People don't ask you about the future. What do you think's out there in the fungal world medicinally? What can you see in your fungal crystal ball in terms of the next beta blockers or the next antibiotics for drug-resistant bugs?
Well, very clearly, the research that we've been doing, and I have literally spent more than $1 million on testing psilocybin analogs. It's psilocin. Psilocybin is a prodrug for psilocin. Psilocybin is stable. Psilocin is not. Psilocybin, when you ingest it, converts to psilocin. That's what gets into your bloodstream and activates your receptors. And we found a massive amount of neurogeneration, especially from the psilocybin analogs.
What's neurogeneration?
Neurogeneration is literally what it sounds like. Nerves regenerate. Now, there's 4 terms of art here. There's neurogenesis, which is the origination of newborn nerve cells, typically from stem cells. There's neurogeneration, which means you're generating new neurons. There's neuron regeneration from neurons that begin to atrophy. They're starting to die back.
Right.
And they rebound. And I think really as exciting as neurogenesis is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity speaks to synaptogenesis. More nerves are branching, more conduits. So you can imagine if you had neuropathy with one string of neurons with neuroplasticity, you have more alternative routes for signal transmission. That with niacin seems to be a catalyst. And then adding lion's mane, the mycelium, this is where we have found is coded for upregulation of what's called MAP kinases. And these stimulate, these are proteins that dock with the nerve cells, and upon docking, they cause proliferation. Or in stem cells, it causes them to differentiate in the nerve cells. So what's out there is that, in my phrase, psilocybes and psilocybin is the Einstein molecule,
right,
or the Einstein mushrooms. I think we are on the road, and we have a paper coming out in Nature, scientific reports, very, very soon. We have a psychomotor benefit that we can show, where microdosing with psilocybin, niacin, and lion's mane increases the TAP test from 48 to 68 taps in 10 seconds with an observational study with 55-plus-year-olds. So you don't see this in younger people. Well, microdosing with psilocybin by itself had no effect. And the non-microdoses steadily declined.
Right.
They maybe got habituated, they got bored, they got fatigued. But the people on the stack of these 3 compounds showed statistically significant. The p-value is 0.004. When you look at all the dilutable factors, you have uncontrolled people microdosing with psilocybin they're buying on the black market, variability in potency, variability in the amount of niacin they're taking, and lion's mane, and yet that would all dilute out significance, and yet we have such extraordinary significance. So the future, I think, is that these psilocybin molecules and other tryptamines, stacked with niacin in particular, lion's mane regenerates myelin on the axons of the nerves. I think we can increase our neurological health and age and offset the neurological decline. And this could be potentially, has to be proven by clinical studies, or helping Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, MS, traumatic brain injury. And note to self, as we get older, we're on that slippery slope of neurodegeneration. So it would be nice if the Einsteins of our era, when they're in their 80s and 90s, are at the peak of their intellectual acumen and capacity, so they can pass the knowledge on to the next generation.
Fabulous.
So that's what I think the future is. We can become more intelligent, and I think psilocybin creates smarter, nicer people.
Living proof.
Yeah.
What about in terms of antivirals?
That's a big subject, and but this brings up a bigger subject. I'm an outlier. I didn't get my PhD. I applied and I got accepted in the 4 or 5 graduate schools, but I had adopted a family of 5. I couldn't afford to move everybody. So I'm self-taught. But I'm my 4th paper in Nature, so not too bad.
Right.
Because I'm self-taught. But my research on helping bees overcoming colony collapse is important. Mm-hmm. If you can Google Nature, Stamets, bees, antivirals, and we discovered a reishi mushroom extract made from the mycelium, again, not the mushrooms. The mycelium are have many more genes activated as they navigate through a habitat, so they're constantly in competition. Mm-hmm. Mushroom comes up and rots really, really quickly. So the mycelium can be resident for years. And so it's a very, very active in its immune system. So we take the living mycelium, make a water ethanol extract, add it to the sugar water we're giving to bees. And working with Washington State University, we published this in Nature. I checked the day before yesterday, it's in the 0.1% of all articles ever downloaded on the Nature publication ecosystem. That's pretty extraordinary.
It's very extraordinary.
But that's a measure of the interest because the natural extracts reduce, in one case, there's one virus that harms bees by 45,000 to 1. With one treatment in 10 days, outdoors in beehives, this is an animal clinical study. I think it's the first example where a natural product is more powerful than an antiviral pharmaceutical, for which there is none for bees. But that's why I think there's so much attention. There's an urgent need. It's coming from a natural product. The results are clearly valid. And so what does that mean? That means that mycelium that cruises throughout the ecosystem is offering immunological benefits to many of the animals. So this could be helpful for fighting bird flu, monkeypox, COVID, many viral vectors that are converging on us in a time of increasing viral storms. Protecting the forest could be protecting our immune system of the planet and the individual animals within, including us and bees. So I think this is the tip of the iceberg.
So when they give the Nobel Prize for apiology, have you written your speech? So talk to me for a minute about the shamanic connection between bees and honey and mushrooms.
That's fascinating. With the phrase "necessity is the mother of invention."
Right.
Imagine this: you're a Mesoamerican indigenous person. You collect psilocybe mexicana, whatever it is. It's humid. It's wet. That's why the mushrooms are coming up. You pick them. The mushrooms are gone in 3 to 4 days. Mm-hmm. How do you preserve them?
Right.
You try to dry them. Mm-hmm. I was in Palenque. You've been in Palenque. Drying mushrooms in Palenque is not easy. The humidity is
100% humidity, no.
Right. So you can put them in honey. Mm-hmm. Well, in the Bavarian Beer Act of 1516, if I got my date right, you can look it up, they banned mushrooms in beer. Mm-hmm. And they were making meads back then. Mm-hmm. So, and then you look at the cave art from northern Algeria, the famous Tassili cave art with mm-hmm. a bee man. As a bee figure man or woman surrounded by mushrooms.
Right.
So the idea of necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
Then 3 disparate cultures, there's evidence clearly that honey is a preservative. Well, who knew that? Well, lots of people knew that. So that, I think, speaks to these concoctions. And Andy Weil gets tons of credit for the natural mind.
Correct.
And I read that too. And when he's talked about people spinning to get dizzy as fun and children do it, this impulse to change your consciousness is innate within us.
That's the classic.
So these non-ordinary states of reality, I think we need to pay attention to. And I could follow this up with another thought or two, but let me just try.
Have at it.
I believe it's the minorities within civilizations and societies that drive evolution. The conventional wisdom, by definition, is the majority.
Right.
The outliers, like you, me, Tina Wasson, Maria Sabina, mm-hmm. Dominant cultures come in, suppress minority opinion. The outliers are thought to be on the fringe, but they're not on the fringe. They're on the edge, the cusp of scientific advancement and breakthrough. And so it's the minorities that have to be protected mm-hmm. because they're the innovators. And the conventional wisdom are, unfortunately, the oppressors. The oppressor dominant society suppresses the minority views. And yet the minority individuals, these are the leaders of change. And this is why we need to protect all minorities.
Couldn't agree more. Well, I think we sell these things short when we talk about them as hallucinogens. Yes, they induce hallucinations, but it's so much more. I mean, entheogens, okay, they induce the God within. But what about the creative process? What about the great ideas? What about curing your stammer? You know,
I still have it.
Calling it hallucinogens, it's reductionist.
It is. It's an inadequacy of our language. You know, psychedelic was invented. Entheogens, that's about the best one that's out there right now. Feeling imbued with the spirit of God, I would say goodness. So this is something that I think is truly remarkable. We have not even begun to understand the potential positive benefits of these sacraments. And indigenous wisdom has really set the stage. It's been the foundation for scientific advancement. What's so exciting to me as a scientist is to see how much indigenous wisdom is validated, but upon that is improved. You know, so
it's the best of both worlds.
It's the best of both worlds.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
a phrase I heard recently, and a Native American elder, in explaining to a group of elementary children the importance of getting a Western education.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's two-eyed seeing. And as he explained it, one eye with an indigenous perspective, with the wisdom of indigenous culture, the other eye with Western education. And with two eyes, you can see much clearer and better than with one eye. And this is an indigenous invented phrase. Many of the indigenous people I know, they're now mulatto, quote unquote. They're mixed blood. Mm-hmm. My son is 17, my daughter's 17% Navajo. Mm-hmm. And so we have so much indigenous history in all of us, and so many of the indigenous people are now getting the benefits of Western medicine, technology, et cetera, and we get the benefits of their ancient wisdom. So I like this idea of two eyes seeing. It brings people together in commonality that we can focus on our future. The past is the past. We must not forget it. There is a lot of regret about the past. We can't change the past. We can forge together to create a new future that's better for everyone.
Well, I like this concept of the two-eye. My buddy Tim Ferriss says that all ethnobiologists are boundary walkers by definition. Mm-hmm. And it's more than two boundaries, or more than one boundary, right? I was reading a quote by Horace, the poet laureate of ancient Rome, and he said, "No poem was ever written by a drinker of water." Okay, that altered states are necessary. It's not just mushrooms, it's not just plants, it's alcohol, which of course is plants, and fungi. But that the way these substances can help us enhance creativity, come up with new ideas, new ways of thinking. The flip side is to think that, you know, the more dope you smoke, the wiser you get. We know that's not true. But how do you strike that medium so you're using these things as enhancers, and you're not trapped in like always wanting to do more, or not saying, "Oh, I can't do that because I got to hold my tenuous grip on reality."
Well, many people don't know about Bruce Damer, who's here, and his epiphanies from psychoactive experiences. But everyone knows about PCR.
Right.
And Carrie Mullis.
Tell that story.
Carrie Mullis discovered discovered PCR by taking LSD, being on the beach, and looking at bullwhip kelp. Mm-hmm. And then he had the concept of PCR. Crazy guy. He died, unfortunately, a few years ago. I think he was the only Nobel laureate that they ever had to call the police on.
So I heard. Tell that story too.
I just know that number of wine bottles. It was measuring the gravity and acceleration, and he was doing timing and watching wine bottles fall from the 20th floor.
Drinking them first, I'm sure.
It was a scientific experiment. But that's an example of where a psychedelic, an epiphany, then you have Watson and Crick debated, and then you have another group, another woman scientist also gets credit. But there's many examples of that where the psychedelic state of mind was the milieu for a creative thinking that led to something truly a scientific breakthrough.
Okay, so this whole PCR story, and PCR, as you know, is one of the greatest inventions in primate history, okay? But there's a second part of this which speaks to the value of nature that's often not told as in almost a coda or a denouement, and that is that Thomas Brock went into the hot springs in Yellowstone and pulled the organism out that makes PCR possible. So that it's not just that this guy was tripping his brains out on a motorcycle and doing crazy stuff and came up with this brilliant idea, that it was a natural product which was part of the solution. And that's
sourced from nature.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So this idea that, in the age of high throughput screening or combinatorial chemistry, that we don't need Mother Nature. I mean, we have to remember that Mother Nature not only created chemicals too numerous to mention, she created those chemists in the first place.
Yeah, indeed. And this is what, for instance, we see really strong evidence of neurogeneration benefit from the entourage of the psilocybin analogs, perfectly legal, baocystin, norbaocystin, norpsilocin, and these analogs have neurogenic activity. So now you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. I mentioned this. There's 89 studies. Almost every one of them is the psilocybin molecule.
Right.
Yet no one's using the psilocybin molecule in public. 99.999% of people are using psilocybe cubensis. Mm-hmm. It has the entourage effect of these other analogs. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine who is a medical doctor who approved by the Canadian government has taken 2 cohorts, 9 and 7 people, through end of life with high doses of psilocybin. Mm-hmm. This last cohort, there were people taking the psilocybin molecule and a person taking the psilocybin mushroom. Mm-hmm. The person who had taken psilocybin mushrooms had taken the psilocybin molecule before. Mm-hmm. And so it's the first really good description of the difference. Do you want to know what the difference was between the molecule versus the mushroom? Yeah, okay. They described it as this. The psilocybin molecule, I realize you take it, psilocybin pure form, goes to your gut, very quickly metabolized, right? You don't have to break it down. Mm-hmm. So they described it as like the experience was like a box. They took it and it went way up like this, had this plateau, extraordinarily powerful experience, and then dropped down. Mm-hmm. And then the experience was over. Mm-hmm. Well, that person described when they took the psilocybin mushrooms, it was this slope, which makes sense. It's being digested. Mm-hmm. You have more, entourage effect of the psilocybin analogs. It sloped up, had this peak experience. Mm-hmm. But he said the most valuable thing was when it was sloping down, which has sloped down for a long time, he was able to process.
Excellent.
He was able to think. Mm-hmm. He was able to contemplate, reflect. It was like, I used to hang glide. Mm-hmm. And those us hang gliders out there, it's a great feeling if you do a heroic flight to come down on green grass at a very slow, nice glide, as opposed to plummeting to the earth.
Better than a plummet.
So there's interesting. It's more meditative. It's more contemplative. We know that neurogenically, we believe, again, it has to be proven by clinical studies, but I think it offers more benefit. So the entourage effect of these complex molecular mixtures offers a benefit that the individual molecules do not.
Describe the entourage effect.
The entourage effect is when you have several ingredients, molecules, you can call them, that individually may offer some benefit, but when you add them together, it's not only cumulative, like 1 + 1 + 1 = 3, but 1 + 1 + 1 = 10. And so you have synergism. Mm-hmm. So the entourage effect implies synergism, where you get much more activity. One of the greatest example that's commonly used is gunpowder. Mm-hmm. The Chinese invented gunpowder, but the patent office, for instance, has this as a gating issue. How can you patent a natural product? Right. Well, they use gunpowder. If it was not invented, it was invented today by an inventor, you take sulfur, charcoal, and potassium nitrate. I'm not revealing anything that's not known, but individually of which they don't have an effect. The entourage effect of those three is explosive. Yeah. That's what we're finding with the tryptamines and ayahuasca, and I believe for sure in mushrooms. I think we're going to see this explosive synergism of entourage, which makes it truly, truly exciting.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please remember to give us a good rating and to subscribe and share with like-minded folks. We appreciate your support for the protection of the knowledge and biodiversity of South America by the Amazon Conservation Team. In our next episode, we'll continue this discussion with Paul Stamets and Dr. Plotkin, delving deeper to take a look at the intersection of fungi, mortality, and ethnobotany.